There's just something oh so delicious about having a fast 35mm lens, and in this video I'll give my user impressions about the Samyang AF 35mm f1.4 version 2. Full disclaimer, Samyang sent out this lens for me to try out, and opinions are my own, like they are around my controlling wife. 35mm lenses are essential for many photographers and filmmakers, arguably the most useful prime lens. The focal length is dynamic and you can use the perspective to your advantage, like how marriage makes you appreciate freedom.
Wow.
I'll be doing a breakdown of this lens, and before I get to the technical aspects, let's take a look at what this lens can do. Alright, now it's time to look at the build. The lens has a full metal build, and it could be my imagination, but it feels like this version is more solid and stiff than the previous version, and that's typically what happens when your ex decides to upgrade. Having owned the previous version, I would say that the manual focus feels mostly the same. However, there is an additional button for focus hold, and the wheel can be programmed for aperture. The lens offers full weather sealing, and the rear gasket is particularly hard to see, but it's there. Here's the full diagram. Have a look. In practice, it seems to work fine. I didn't have an issue while shooting my kids around in the backyard playing with their water toys. I use a front filter for easy cleaning. The rest of the specs can be seen right here. Up next is Bokeh. I thought the previous version was swell. However, this time I'll put it up side by side with the comparatively priced Sony 35mm f1.8. At this close distance, this is what 2/3 of a stop looks like. The Samyang does produce quite a bit more blur, and the blur is a cleaner look. At longer distances, the bokeh is less noticeable. However, it still exists. Let me zoom in just a little bit more so you have a better view of it. At further distances, the bokeh isn't as pronounced, but it still exists. The Samyang 35mm AF version 2 does produce more blur. Let's take a look at sharpness, and once again, we'll compare it with the Sony 35mm f1.8. Before we start the sharpness test, I want to show that the Samyang is dramatically wider than the Sony 35 f1.8. Here it is. Here's the Samyang, and here's the Sony. As you can see, there's a big difference, isn't there? Starting off at the center, the Samyang is at f1.4, Sony is at f1.8. And I'd say that the Samyang has a slight lead. It's a little bit sharper. Going towards the mid frame, that's where Sony takes the lead. It's a little bit better in this fencing detail. At the far edges, I would say Samyang has a little bit of a lead. This fencing is just a little bit clearer, and all these details on the floor just a little bit better. We go towards equal aperture. At f1.8 on both lenses, the Samyang is clearly better at the edge. Going towards the mid frame, and there I'd say the Sony still has a slight lead. We go towards the center, and the Samyang reclaims the lead. It's much sharper. Stopping down to f2.8, the Samyang gets really sharp in the center. At the edge, they are neck and neck, basically the same. And the far edges, this is where Samyang has a much bigger lead. Everything is just so much more clear. Stopping down to f8, and the Samyang has a little bit more of a lead. It is definitely more sharp It has a little bit of more bite to it, going towards the mid frame, and I'd say they're fairly comparable at this point. And back to the center, it's comparable at this point. Up next is autofocus, and before I get into that subject, I want to state that this lens does make a tiny bit of noise. Let's have a listen to it. It's not much, I just wanted to state that it exists. Now let's have a look. Before I get to the stills aspect, let's look at how it behaves in video. As you can see, the lens has a slower pace movement, however, it's extremely smooth and pleasing. Currently, there's no way to adjust the speed with Lens Station. However, you can modify the speed using your in-camera settings. This is using the A7 Mark IV with its default settings. When it comes to still, the lens is quite snappy and predictable. I was getting a good hit rate using the A7 Mark IV as well as the A7S Mark III. I didn't have any problems. It was hitting it and hitting it accurately. I can't speak to other camera bodies. However, as fast as it may appear here, the Sony FE35 f1.8 was even faster. Here's a look at CA and LoCA. The lens has some CA viewable at the edges. As you can see right here, let me get to 100%. There is a faint line of purpling, and that's as far as the CA goes. Here's the log used for the autofocus test. As soon as you go out of focus, you can see the foreground bokeh is developing a purpling, and the background also develops a bit of green. It's a moderate amount. Jumping straight to flare, this lens is highly resistant. As you can see that I'm pointing straight at the sun and there isn't much of an issue. There are some blobs here and there, but it's very flare resistant. You'll have no problems shooting directly to the sun. The contrast remains nice and solid. At f16, the Sunstars are nice. There is minor amounts of blobbing going around. The effect is good, and I think most will be happy with this type of performance. Up next is focus breathing. How does this compare up to other lenses in the E-mount system? Let's have a look. Here it is side by side with the 35mm f1.8, and I think it's comparable. However, a little bit later, you'll see one that's not very comparable. So the focus breathing of the Samyang is a tad worse than the Sony 35 f1.8. However, the margin is very small. Here it is next to the 35 G Master, and you can see that the outer frame is moving a lot more. The 35 Samyang behaves much better in this scenario, so you don't have to have an A7 Mark IV that has the focus breathing compensation. This is just how the lens behaves. Samyang 35mm f1.4 version 2 is an interesting upgrade. The button, the switch, and the sealing, all nice revisions. It does position itself well for stills and excels at video with its very low focus breathing, and the alternative is an A7 IV with 35 GM, with compensation correction, with a heavy price tag, with a raging wife. Samyang being f1.4 and not needing the compensation can be a highly desirable option for those who lack access to such feature, including bodies like the A1 and A7S Mark III, among others. The lens is sturdy, offers great optics, good sharpness, smooth and pleasing bokeh with nice flare resistance. The imperfections are slight enough to give a very filmic look while preserving details. Focus is good enough most of the time, and it does work in extreme low light with the A7 IV. Overall, a great companion lens to the Samyang 85mm f1.4, and it won't break the bank. If you enjoyed this video, tell the algorithm by clicking the like button. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one. Take care.